All right, Representative Neu Brindley, I believe we've got everyone who had RSVP'd. If you want to go ahead and pop on camera and we can go ahead and get started.
Sure, thanks, Andrew. And thank you everyone for being here. We're here obviously primarily, or maybe it's not obvious, we're here to talk about the governor's proposal for $35 million for a new SAFE account. And of course, that's primarily intended to help make sure we've got the necessary law enforcement presence during the upcoming Chauvin trial in Minneapolis. I think it starts in March. And we want to make sure, obviously, that we don't see a repeat of the chaos and the riots that happened last summer. That is obviously a priority for us. However, our concern is that we really think the governor needs a little bit of a wake up call here. $35 million is not going to magically solve the underlying problems. Three of Minnesota's lead law enforcement organizations actually wrote a letter to the committee, and I want to read just a small portion of that. And that's from the MPPOA, the Minnesota Sheriff's Association, and the Minnesota Police Chiefs Association. And they said, our members remain concerned that no matter what legislation is passed, the response for mutual aid will not be as robust as the public may want. Our members' concern is due to the continued demonization of law enforcement officers by certain public officials at various levels of government. Which means that $35 million is not going to solve that problem. We actually also polled several of the agencies who did respond last summer to the city of Minneapolis. And many of them said that they were far more concerned about the anti-police sentiments by not just city residents, but city leaders, both. They're far more concerned about the anti-police sentiments than they are about funding concerns. I don't think that was ever their primary concern. And of course, we know that the city of Minneapolis has already cut 118 officers from their budget, and they're discussing cutting that further. Not only that, between the cuts that they've made and just the open positions, they're actually down in the ballpark of 200 officers right now. So again, that 35 million doesn't solve that problem. And not only that, but now we put all of Minnesota on the hook for bad decisions being made in the city of Minneapolis. So that's what we're here to talk about. That's why we're here today. And I'm going to turn the time over to our lead on the Public Safety Committee, Representative Brian Johnson.
Good afternoon. Welcome for coming here today. On top of the concerns outlined by
Representative Johnson, your audio is bad. I wonder, maybe try turning your camera off.
Democrats brought forward a series of amendments to a bill that is Representative Neu Brindley. Is this any better?
That does sound a little bit better.
Got my earbud.
Great.
Okay. Besides the concerns that Representative Neu Brindley brought forward, Democrats brought forward a series of amendments yesterday that took several steps backwards on this proposal. One of the biggest concerns is that it put the Commissioner of Public Safety in sole charge of deciding the reimbursement process, leaving the legislature completely out of the picture. This seems to be a theme throughout the year. Fortunately, the scope of the bill was expanded to include response planning, after-action costs, costs within the community, as eligible for reimbursement. The fund is intended to ensure sufficient enforcement response, and it should be limited to that. The bill does not exclude the city of Minneapolis from being eligible for these funds. In theory, the Minneapolis could apply for and receive funding from this account for planning and other preparation work. Lastly, the bill requires the Post Board to create a model policy for public assembly response. and require that any responding law enforcement agency be held to those standards, even if there is no violation of their own department's policy. An officer could lose his license. And I also did check with my home department. Guess what? They have a policy to deal with this issue, just like the vast majority of departments across the state. And they are all a little bit different, dealing with the issues inside their own community. Ultimately, one of the biggest concerns, as Representative Anne Neu Brindley mentioned, it is the president that is set moving forward. If the city of Minneapolis Council proceeds with its plan to defund or abolish the police department, it puts the Minnesota taxpayers on the hook for those poor decisions. It also allows Minneapolis to escape responsibility for what they owe currently to the agencies in the response last summer, and for the anti-law enforcement sentiment that they are fostering in their city. I'm now going to turn it over to Representative Novotny.
Thank you, Representative Johnson. As a recently retired peace officer, my concern is that the people on the ground, the men and women that run to the call for help, including the National Guard that have been called in so many times, have the support in the materials, support in the proper staffing levels, and most importantly, support in decisive leadership. Last summer, I toured the burn area with a group of representatives just after the fires were put out. I heard the pain in the voices of the residents of the area as they were telling the stories of calling 911 and being told no police were available. They were in a struggle for their own survival at that point. They were told there was no help on the way. No fire trucks were going to be sent because they were already all being used. As we stood at the corner of Chicago and Lake, fingers were being pointed and accusations were being made. But when it was done, when all the blame was placed, it didn't matter to the victims that lost their homes, that lost their businesses, some that had spent their lifetime building those businesses up. The only question we should have had at Chicago and Lake is, how do we keep this from happening again? Every Minnesotan has a right to protest, to have their voice heard, and to peaceably demonstrate. Just like every Minnesota person that lives in South Minneapolis or North Home, Minnesota, should be able to get a response to a call for help. Every Minnesotan that leaves their house to go to work after pinning on a badge, who is willing to run to the sound of gunfire to answer the cry for help, should know that the people of Minnesota have their backs. I would like to close with this. It should be said, it has been said that there are no atheists in a foxhole. There should be no politics in emergency response, and we should all protect those that we have been sworn to protect or elected to serve. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Representative Neu Brindley.
All right, and with that, we'll open it up to questions. I believe Bill Warner is up first.
Yeah, can you folks hear me? I think I'm unmuted. Yeah, very good. Representative Novotny just said, how do we keep this from happening again was one of the key questions at Chicago and Lake. What the proponents of this $35 million will say is that that's what we're trying to do, is to keep it from happening again, despite all of the finger pointing and perhaps the dereliction of duty on the part of officials in Minneapolis or even in the state level. Some will say they say they're trying to avoid having it happen again because there could potentially be trouble when the officers go on trial. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I would say, that's exactly right. We also want to prevent, obviously, what happened last summer. Our concern is that this bill doesn't do that. We're putting money into the system, but like I said, we have surveyed agencies that did respond last summer. We have a statement from the Sheriff's Association and the Minnesota Police Chiefs Association and the MPPOA saying that I will just read it one more time. Our members' concern is due to the continued demonization of law enforcement offers by certain public officials at various levels of government. They're not concerned about the finances of this. They are concerned about the demonization of law enforcement. And that continues in the city of Minneapolis. So our concern is that the $35 million doesn't actually solve the problem.
Are you saying, Representative, if I may, just one quick follow-up, that the law enforcement community in Minnesota is saying, and that would include the law enforcement community in the Twin Cities, is saying that they don't need any extra money to prepare for what potentially could happen when these officer trials are taking place? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm certainly not prepared to speak on behalf of all the different law enforcement agencies. All I can do is share the feedback that we've been given.
But you surely would have asked them the question, do you need additional money? I mean, I think, most folks would agree that police officers should not be demonized, or at least many people would agree. But are they also saying, hey, we need some additional resources because there could potentially be trouble? I mean, I assume you asked them that question, or didn't you?
Well, again, the feedback that we are getting is that no matter what legislation is passed, it doesn't solve the problem. So if we pass this $35 million SAFE Act or SAFE account, it actually does not solve the problem. It doesn't get us to the place of making sure that we are preventing the chaos and riots that happened last summer.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Ricardo Lopez.
Hi, thanks. This is Ricardo Lopez with the Reformer. Yeah, I mean, I guess, sort of keeping on the same subject there, I'm just curious, what one has to do with the other, because you're talking about this major objection about the demonization of law enforcement. When I think the problem here, at least according to the governor's proposal, is that he wants to make sure that the state is prepared for any potential unrest, demonstrations, to avoid a repeat of what happened last summer. Republicans criticized him for being very slow to respond. It took 4 days for the National Guard to come in and achieve the peace that was necessary. So I'm just curious what, attacking over the demonization of police has to do with the problem, which is trying to prevent a repeat of last summer.
I'll be honest, I am having a hard time understanding how we don't see the connection here. What we're saying is that the governor is trying to solve this problem by passing legislation to provide $35 million in this SAFE account. What we are hearing from law enforcement is that simply passing this legislation does not solve that problem. It doesn't get us to the place of being more prepared. And the governor's slow response last summer were those things that were under the governor's purview. Those things were calling in the National Guard. The response absolutely was slow in calling in the National Guard. We, Representative Novotny and I believe Representative Brian Johnson was there that same day that we toured Minneapolis. And we were told by business owners that on Wednesday, they were told to go home. They had successfully on their own protected their businesses for a couple of days. They were told to go home because the National Guard would be there to protect their businesses that night. And the National Guard was not there. And of course, we know what happened that Wednesday. I mean, that the response absolutely was slow, but that had nothing to do with the responding officers from other agencies. That was the governor's slowness in calling up the National Guard to be of help. So I'm not sure what that actually has to do with this current language.
Yeah, but again, we're about a month away here from the start of the trial. Minneapolis Police Department is down, a couple hundred officers. And if, I mean, what would be the solution to this problem that you're identifying? I mean, do you need the governor to issue some proclamation in support of law enforcement? I mean, what solves the problem of demonizing police when right now the more pressing concern seems to be preventing the unrest that we saw last summer next month?
Well, certainly. And again, we all agree that we want to prevent that. But again, what we are hearing from law enforcement, again, I just read that letter twice. What we are hearing from law enforcement, both through what they have submitted to committees and through our own surveying of agencies who responded last summer, is that this $35 million bill does not get there. It does not get us to a place where these folks are going to be ready to enter into these mutual aid agreements. The $35 million is not their primary concern.
All right, Kevin Featherly.
Hi, Rep. Novotny. Yesterday in committee, you said, what's our end goal here? We're looking at a request for $35 million to bail out the city of Minneapolis and possibly the city of St. Paul. And you're asking someone from Little Fork, Minnesota to pay toward problems that will occur in 1 or 2 cities. That smacks of some of the discussion that happened in the Senate when Senator Rosen said that her constituents are saying that they don't want their taxpayers to pay for the damage in St. Paul. And yet we know that 3/4 of the population lives in the Twin Cities. The tax base is here. The money flows out. Is this really a bailout? And how do you defend that kind of stance when you know that really money is flowing out? It's not flowing into the Twin Cities overall.
To defend my stance because I believe you're confusing different funds and different responses. This cash reserve will be to pay for whatever emergency responses are needed going forward. Under current Minnesota state statute, in absence of this account, the city of Minneapolis would be responsible for paying for the extra services needed. If they call a law enforcement agency from somewhere outstate to come to respond and help, city of Minneapolis is responding as by statute they're called the receiving agency. The agency receiving aid is responsible for paying that. So don't confuse damage with responses going forward.
I understand. Is this, though, in fact, a bailout? We're not really hearing that in this press conference. That was stated yesterday.
Well, I believe I just said that. If this bill doesn't pass, whatever happens going forward by Minnesota state statute, I believe it's 12.33, Minneapolis is a receiving agency, and they're the ones that are supposed to be paying the bill. Now, the state of Minnesota is still partially on the hook too, because so much of the Guard and the State Patrol and the conservation officers are part of the response. So.
Yeah, we can't forget here too that the city of Minneapolis is down 200 officers, and that has consequences, and that's based on decisions they've made, and that has consequences.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew. Take the next one.
Oh, go ahead, Representative Johnson. Did you want to weigh in on that?
Sorry.
Yeah, as far as the taxes go, the general the amount of taxes that are paid at the state level for public safety is small. Most of the tax that law enforcement get for their police departments, their sheriff's office, that's your local property tax. That's for going for the safety and security in your own community. And by bringing our guys down there into the metro, where they're supposed to have their property taxes paying for their safety and security, it's taken away from the rest of the state.
Thank you, Andrew. Go ahead.
All right, Sarah Meerhoff.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Okay, this is a question for Representative Neu Brindley, but if others want to weigh in, that would be great too. I hear, Representative, what you're saying about the need to change public perception and support of law enforcement. I think it's reasonable to say, though, that that's not going to change in the next month. And so if this fund isn't going to address that need, but the need is quite immediate for preventing unrest during the trials that are starting in a month. I'm just wondering, what do you propose we do now for next month instead of the SAFE fund?
Sure. Well, and again, I mean, that's exactly our concern, and that's exactly why we are here today to say, we really do think the governor needs a bit of a wake-up call on this, because this 35 million does not solve the problem. And frankly, we're open to the legislation. And if we thought that this was going to solve the problem, I think we'd be even more open. But there is this underlying problem that goes well beyond this funding. And so, I mean, really, from our perspective, if we are in a situation a month from now where additional law enforcement is needed, the governor is going to have to consider those resources that are under his purview. Because even with the SAFE account, they're not making anyone enter into mutual aid agreements with the city of Minneapolis. And like I said, I mean, we've been very clear that, the agencies that we've spoken to who responded last summer, we have testimony submitted via a letter in committee that tells us the $35 million does not solve that problem. So that's our concern as well. And the governor is going to have to consider what things are under his purview.
And if I could add for just a second too, when we say, you need to understand, when we spoke yesterday in committee, the part of the problem is the governor is asking for the $35 million to put into the slush fund. And then they throw all the strings attached. They want to have a policy that the officers responding have a policy. Who's going to be checking for that? When the call for help goes out, is there going to be someone, is State Patrol going to post people at the entrances to the city and make sure everyone's got a card to verify that you have a policy in place that says you will follow your department's policy? That's where my concern comes in, when the few Minneapolis officers that are left that have weathered the storm of the last year call for help. They should get that help, and they should get that help right away.
Yeah, I want to put a little finer point on this as well, and just reiterate that the expectation is that a month from now, the governor and local leaders are not calling in agencies to help once riots are already happening. I think the expectation is that Governor Walz, along with state DPS and local leaders, will anticipate what is happening. They did not do a good job of that last summer, and have a plan in place to prevent these emergencies from happening to begin
Right.
If I could just,
go
could I
ahead,
just
Sarah.
ask a follow-up? Thank you. So just to be clear, are you guys proposing any legislation to be passed in the next month instead of the SAFE fund?
We actually already have law enforcement agencies capable of dealing with civil unrest, and certainly, especially being prepared for things that are predictable. So I'm not sure that there is a reason that we would need to pass legislation. And frankly, we're in the minority. As much as I wish that we could do something, that's actually not how the legislature works.
All right, Brian Bax.
Hey, this is more of a technical point here, but yesterday Colonel Langer talked about how he's working with local partners at the city and county levels, and how he said that he would be requesting additional help. Is there a circumstance here in which the county or the state would be perceived as the receiving agency and therefore be responsible for assuming costs to pay other responding communities rather than the city of Minneapolis? And if so, do you foresee having a fund to pay the state share or the county share if need be?
Well, we know that that's, oh, go ahead, Brian Johnson, Representative Johnson.
Oh, I can say this, the sheriff is the chief law enforcement officer of the county. And if he would call it in, he would have authority over the city of Minneapolis as the chief law enforcement of the county. So he could do that. I'm not sure if the state could call it, but I'm not sure if they could actually supersede the sheriff in his responsibilities.
Certainly, the city of Minneapolis has actually made that claim regarding at least one responding agency that they did not ask for help. The State Patrol did, so they are choosing to not pay that. So certainly, there's a circumstance where that can happen. I don't know what's going to happen with that right now. But to be clear, as a legislature, we have supported our state agencies, our state law enforcement agencies. And, our State Patrol responded and we made sure that they were made whole for that. So certainly we have done that, but it would be really problematic if the city of Minneapolis tried to circumvent the process, or if any of our leaders try to circumvent the legislative process and appropriations by using that as a means around responsibility.
And there are requests from the DNR and the State Patrol for funds to pay the overtime and lodging and et cetera for the officers that they're planning to bring in beginning in March for potentially weeks at a time. Do you anticipate paying that or supplying that money in advance, or do you want to wait to see what the actual costs are and reimburse later?
Well, the legislature has passed some of that funding already, and those are things certainly that we can consider as they're brought before the legislature. But as I said previously, we've already passed some of that funding, and we certainly made them whole for what happened last year.
Right, that was for last year. They've already come up with what they expect the costs to be for March, the trial of Derek Chauvin, and potentially in August, depending on what happens. But they say that they need X amount in March to pay for those costs of bringing in personnel from around the state.
That was one of the issues we have with this bill, because it's first come, first serve who the Commissioner Harrington would give the funds to. We could have departments that send 10 people, but they're farther down the list, while he has already paid for the state agencies out of this $35 million. So we don't know. So there's some issues dealing with that part of it, because there's no say or no process of how the funds are actually distributed, whether it's fairly at a percentage by who has people there and a percentage of costs combined from everybody.
All right, Carolyn from WCCO.
Hi, yes. The letter from the police association, or the law enforcement coalition, excuse me, is often referenced for that line at the bottom or the last paragraph talking about, no matter the legislation that's passed, there will be mutual aid will not be as robust as the public may expect. And, this continued, concern about demonization of law enforcement. This is just kind of similar, but reiterating that question from Sarah a few moments ago. I'm just curious why, in this same letter, the paragraph before, they're saying, we thank Governor Walz for including this safe fund in his budget. But then acknowledging that, that there's this persistent problem. So I'm curious again, why there's this notion of, is there something better than nothing? If there's no legislation that you think that needs to be passed to deal with, getting ahead of things and ensuring public safety, that's not this budget or not this proposal. I'm curious, why there's so much, I guess, contention around this issue when clearly they do support this according to the letter, but acknowledge that greater problem again. So long way of saying, is something better than nothing to at least get things moving here to prevent, further disaster and chaos in a couple weeks.
Yeah, I would say again, I would just reiterate that we are open to the legislation, although clearly there's some needed changes as Representative Johnson laid out. We are open to the legislation. Our problem is that it doesn't solve the problem. This actually doesn't get us to a place that we are preventing the chaos and riots happening in Minneapolis again. And so we need to see movement from the governor and other local leaders. We need to know how they're going to get to that place. As we see in government over and over and over again, putting money into a situation doesn't necessarily solve a problem. And while yes, certainly it can be helpful, we have very clear testimony in this case that it is not going to solve this problem. It may be part of the solution, and again, we are open to that, but we need to see how they're actually going to solve the problem. We need a wake-up call on this.
But to be clear, if I just may follow up, so when you say you're open to this conversation, but you want some changes among them that were just mentioned, you know, the policy for how you respond and some issues with, you know, DPS having jurisdiction over where the money goes, but the idea of funds, an account to reimburse, a slush fund to have reimbursement for mutual aid and those sorts of costs, you're not necessarily ruling out the fact that you would be open to money, or is that completely off the table? Because it would seem that you guys earlier were saying that you weren't open to this idea of a fund because it's, you know, a quote bailout, or, you know, that the taxpayers of greater Minnesota shouldn't be on the hook for stuff in Minneapolis. So I just want to make sure I'm clear that you are open now to the discussion of funds, or you aren't.
You actually just said it perfectly, that this is a slush fund, and Representative Johnson laid out several of the specific issues with this bill. But we also have said that we are open to the legislation. Our position is simply that it doesn't solve the problem, and we're going to need to see movement from the governor and local leaders in order to believe that we are actually going to solve the problem.
All right, Kevin Featherly, didn't DPS say that State Patrol already has in its budget the cost of protecting the Capitol? I can follow up with you offline on that, Kevin. Any other questions?
Well, wait a minute, why do you want to follow up offline? I'd like to hear the answer to that.
If someone knows the answer, Kevin Featherly asked in the chat, didn't DPS say that the State Patrol already has in its budget that costs of protecting the Capitol and freeways? So this fund likely wouldn't be applied to that agency. Is that something one of you can answer?
That was in the hearing yesterday, was it not?
I don't sit on the committee. I did not hear that. Perhaps Representative Novotny or Representative Johnson are aware. I would just say, you know, words matter in the legislature, and while it maybe not be spelled out directly, and DPS may be saying that now, this bill still certainly allows for payments to those agencies.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions? All right. Do you want to wrap it up, Anne?
Yeah, you know, we do really appreciate the time, and we know this is sensitive. Clearly, House Republicans have been incredibly supportive of our law enforcement officers, and we will continue to be very supportive of our law enforcement officers. And that's really our intention with all of this. The governor is trying to solve a problem with money right now that we believe needs to be solved through a real wake-up call and some policy changes on the local level, and some acknowledgement that money, it does not solve this problem. You know, like I said, we've been very clear on what we're hearing from our law enforcement agencies, and we need to look at the bigger picture here. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, everybody.